Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
On a very sunny day, again, in West Michigan, we are delighted to have you indoors today for several hours to talk about a very critical topic for all of us. When I'm looking at this picture right here, downtown, a central part of downtown Grand Rapids, a wonderful city, a growing city, a vibrant city. Not too many cities in Michigan can say that right now. We can, and that's a good thing. When we look at this, we look at the central city and out to the suburbs, and then out to the townships and the distant communities. We talk about a place that all of us call home. It's one region, it's one hometown with individual places where we live. These places that we call home run on infrastructure. It's the meat and the potatoes of our communities. It's the roads that we drive on, the bridges that take us across the rivers and railroads. It is the sewer systems and the water systems that service our hometowns and our communities. And it is just all of the interconnection of all of that infrastructure that is so critical, not only to our quality of life, but also to our economic vitality. So it's important that we take care of it, and it is absolutely critical that we make wise and prudent decisions on how we invest in that infrastructure. I think we've done a pretty good job on this end of the state compared to some other areas. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of lessons that still need to be learned. And hopefully this morning, with our first speaker, our keynote speaker, we will take away from this conference some good ideas on how we can think ahead, plan ahead, do it wisely, do it with good thought, and make very necessary improvements in our infrastructure in the years ahead. Rob Puentes is with us this morning. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Rob, we appreciate you making the flight over here. Luckily, you got out because Laura was tied up at National, it looks like. Rob is a fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He has been with them for 7 years. He has a master's degree in urban planning from UVA, the University of Virginia. And he lives in Northern Virginia. I was asking him about the traffic there. We never quite got an answer because he just kind of rolled his eyes and turned away. It really is a mess. We'll talk about that another time. What he is here today to talk about with us is this concept of infrastructure. Making wise, prudent decisions and basing our investments in infrastructure on good thinking, solid analysis, so that we can stretch our infrastructure dollars to the maximum extent possible. Rob has a lot of experience in this area and in his current role at the Brookings Institute. He has a number of initiatives that are looking at various infrastructure questions, not only in D.C. with the policymakers, but also around the country. So he joins us here today to kind of walk us through where we're at in terms of making wise investments, being smarter, being better at our decision making when it comes to infrastructure. It is my pleasure to have him here today, and it is my pleasure at this time to introduce, and please give a warm West Michigan welcome to Rob Puentes from the Brookings Institute.
Wow, what a great introduction. I really appreciate that. Very kind words. Not what we're used to. Especially saying this person is from Washington and then people clap. It usually doesn't work that way, but I do appreciate it. I want to first thank Don again for the kind introduction, and thank you, Mayor Buck, for emceeing the event. Thank you to Andy Bowman for pulling it together and keeping the trains running on time, and to Gail. Was she here? Gail was very helpful in pulling everything together and making sure that I knew where I was going, so I do appreciate all the help from the staff. You can see the title of the presentation, a smart infrastructure agenda for the 21st century. And kind of to build off what Don was talking about, I chose the title intentionally because it is generally my belief that the infrastructure policies we have today in this country, the things that are driving a lot of the conversations that Don and the Mayor talked about, really aren't 21st century policies. They don't fit the realities of the 21st century. We have these legacy systems that are left over from the 20th century that helped build this nation into the great entity it is today. They really need to be fundamentally reformed for the 21st century. This is a real important time for metropolitan areas, for cities, suburbs, and for the global competitiveness of the country, as Don was talking about. But the infrastructure policies don't fit those realities of today. We are a metropolitan nation, and we are undergoing massive, massive changes on a dramatic scale and complexity, which I'll talk about. But we are just not focusing the built environment around those changes. We have a lot of work to do in this country. I'm not going to tell you a lot about Grand Rapids here today. There's a couple of slides on Grand Rapids, but you guys know it a hell of a lot better than I do, so I'm not going to tell you a lot about Grand Rapids. My goal here instead is to tee up the conversation that you're going to have for the rest of the day. Hopefully be a little provocative, ask a couple of hard questions, maybe say things you don't agree with, and that's, I think, fine. But I like the way the conference was put together. I like the way that you stretched into all these other areas and focused on energy and metropolitan planning and these area sector plans you have here. I think it's a very good comprehensive approach to dealing with the issue of infrastructure, because really in a lot of places, infrastructure means building more today, and building more for economic growth. And it's really this kind of linear discussion that really doesn't have any place in metropolitan America today. So you have a lot of this covered, no doubt. The discussions about infrastructure usually get down to specific projects. I don't have a whole lot to say about specific projects that are either being proposed in this region or in other places. I'm going to kind of keep it up at the ivory tower level, I should say. So it's easy for me to kind of to look down from the ivory tower in Washington and to talk about some of these broad range of policies and decision-making processes that are going on across the country, and to provide just a framework for the real nuts and bolts stuff you're going to talk about today. So I'll provide a broad overview on a portion of the issues. I'll provide a national perspective, not just federal, inside of Washington, but a national conversation about what's going on across the country, and hopefully set the table for the rest of the day. I think setting the foundation is a really good name for the conference. I should have stolen it for the title of my talk, but that's really what I want to do today. I am from Washington, so I do have a PowerPoint. My 9-year-old actually they did a presentation on toucans or something, and they made them do PowerPoints. I thought, this is just raising the kids the wrong way. It is Washington. So I do have a PowerPoint. The good thing about being stuck in the airport is I did get to revise the presentation over and over again, so I have lots and lots of notes I'll have to go back to. All the stuff I'm going to present today, it should be up on our website, either in the reports that I'm going to cite here, and the presentation will be up there afterwards. So I think we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end, so keep those in mind. Infrastructure is hot. It's a really hot issue nowadays. I don't think you probably heard people get up and say that before, but I'm a policy wonk, and infrastructure really is a really hot issue right now all across the country. There are national commissions that are focused on developing a broad federal vision for transportation. There are all these financing commissions that are going on across the country. Each region, each state is having their own conversations. Some of it is because of lack of funding, lack of resources, but infrastructure is a really, really hot issue now. But beyond just the revenues and the resource side, a lot of it is based on the metropolitan level on these projections of growth that are starting to appear, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But metropolitan areas are starting to realize that the growth that we have undertaken over the last couple of decades may have served us well in some respects, but in lots and lots of places, it's probably not sustainable over the long term for a lot of different reasons, but most particularly because of the infrastructure needed to serve that new growth and development. So the preface for that has really started to initiate a conversation all across the country about infrastructure that I don't think we've seen in quite some time. It's kind of harkened back to old days around the New Deal and Eisenhower and these guys. The way they talk about infrastructure is the way that folks are starting to talk about infrastructure nowadays. Not just policymakers, but civic, corporate, and other leaders. But the thing is, I can't stress enough that it matters very much where you build, and what you build and how you build it. And that part of the conversation really isn't happening. The precision about the infrastructure really isn't happening in many, many places. And maybe because the conversation is just kind of getting going. But there still is this feeling that we just need to build to fit these problems. And it really isn't any more precise than that. It really, really needs to be. And that's going to be, and it might sound intuitive to you. It's intuitive to me. And I may not say it in the presentation, but as I go through this, keep that in mind. And just keep remembering that it's not just about the infrastructure, but as Don and other folks were saying at the beginning, it is about how you build it, where you build it, why you build it. These decisions really need to have some more of this back. Right now, it just doesn't happen. We just don't have the ability to build indiscriminately anymore for lots of different reasons. So I'm going to focus on infrastructure in the context, mostly on surface transportation, water, sewer, housing, and other aspects of the built environment. Infrastructure can mean everything. We can talk about energy policies and schools, broadband. I mean, it really means a whole lot of different things to a lot of different people. But a lot of work has been done in these areas. That's where I'm going to focus my conversation today. According to a Brookings report just a couple of years ago, we found the Brookings, or the Grand Rapids metropolitan area had about 435,000 housing units in 2000. To accommodate the growth that's projected for this region, it's going to have to build another 266,000 units by 2030. So really, almost a 50% increase in the amount of units. We know that it's going to have to double its existing commercial and office space, and there's only about 9 metropolitan areas across the country that are going to have to build more industrial space than is projected for the Grand Rapids region. How is all this growth going to be accommodated? And folks probably may have different numbers, may dispute some of these claims, but these were generally designed to be conservative numbers, just based on what we know from just general projections of the census and from other folks, and then calculating that into a number for the built environment. How much housing are we going to need to build? Where is it going to need to be? We really don't have these conversations in many different places. As Don was saying, the growth here in the Grand Rapids region is very different from what's happening in other areas of the Midwest, which are either declining and still building. But the Grand Rapids region is still growing, is still relatively strong, and these are the issues it's going to have to deal with. We're going to have to radically rethink the infrastructure that goes to support trends like this. So the outline for my talk is going to be as follows. I'm going to talk about the national context, so just some broad demographic and some other trends that are driving the context for the discussion about infrastructure. I'm going to talk about major infrastructure challenges that are going on across the country. And you may know some of these, but it's helpful I think to frame them out. I'm going to talk about the infrastructure finance challenges, mostly around surface transportation, because there is a lot of activity around that, creating a lot of consternation across the country. I'll hit on the policy problems, talk about what some of the problems are, not just in Washington, but around the country, and then try to wrap up with what I think would be a smart infrastructure agenda. A lot of this focuses on the state level when we talk about policy responses. Washington is pretty much broken, so you really can't count on Washington to help. The localities can only do so much. The states really have a very, very key role in handling these infrastructure issues. If we have some time, I have some examples of some transformative investment projects that are happening across the country, but I think I've already rambled on too long already, so we may not have time for that. But I do want to leave time for questions at the end. The first thing that I think folks may know, but is generally understood, but is so profoundly important that I just can't be stressed enough, is that the country right now is going through major changes of scale and complexity that some urban historians say we haven't seen in 100 years. That the baby boom stuff after World War II is very important. The turmoil of the 60s and 70s is very important. But the changes that are going on today, for lots of different reasons, harken back to what this nation was going through at the turn of the century. Major changes all across the country. We know that demographically the country is still growing. It's aging, it's diversifying. Population growth, immigration, domestic migration, all these issues are profoundly impacting cities and metropolitan areas all across the country. Economically, there are broad market forces, globalization, technological changes, standardization. It's restructuring the economy, it's structuring what Americans do, where they do it, and how they do it. Obviously, this is a big issue for folks in the Midwest who know better than anybody. And culturally, we know that the nation is changing its attitudes towards cities and suburban living, whether or not you think TV shows have anything to do with that. I personally don't necessarily, but you can't deny there is some kind of new thinking about cities and suburbs, especially older places. Cities are not just places that people flee from, but they really have, they're going on some kind of renaissance now, and cities are hot again. People are moving in. So what this means is that cities, suburbs, and metro areas are facing new opportunities to attract new residents. We know, for example, that young people are delaying marriage longer, women are not having as many children. As a result, household sizes are getting much, much smaller. I think they're an average of 1.5 people smaller today than they were just a couple of decades ago. I don't know who that half person is, but you know what I mean. While household sizes are shrinking, there are still more households. And places like Grand Rapids are still attracting new people. So household sizes are getting smaller. There are new households. It's really changing the way we think about accommodating growth and development. Where's all those new units going to go? Some of them are going to be smaller, and the preferences for different kinds of housing needs may not be the same as they were just a couple of decades ago. We're still building for the quote-unquote nuclear or the traditional family of mom and dad and 3 kids, but the trends show that this is not going to be the dominant household type anymore. It's only about 25% of the national population now, and that number is shrinking pretty quickly. Also, the shift to a knowledge economy is placing a greater and greater emphasis on highly educated and highly skilled workers. I don't mean just folks with law degrees that belong to Washington, but highly skilled in a whole bunch of different areas. We know that those workers are gravitating toward these denser, urbane, lively kind of places. And it's interesting because unlike other or prior generations where young people were finding jobs and then moving to those places, we've seen the opposite happen. Where younger folks are moving to places they like and then finding jobs. It really is shifting the whole thing and putting it on its head. But it is changing the way that we think about places. Futurists, maybe 30 years ago, were talking about the death of distance and that technological changes and all this were going to free us and unanchor us from places, and place wasn't going to matter anymore. You can live on a mountaintop in California and plug into your network, and you can still do that, but really, I think that the futurists were quite wrong in that places matter today more than they've ever mattered before, and how we build and sustain those places has never been more important. It is really, really true that how you grow physically affects how you grow economically, and we'll talk about that. So what all this means is that the growing and diverse population will have different requirements and needs and wants. There's going to be a diverse need for housing types. There's certainly going to be a demand for the traditional single-family homes. We know that, and we have a lot of them all across the country. But we know that at least 1/3 of households have always rented. They're about to continue to rent. There are some folks who think that's going to be even more given what's happening to the housing market and those kinds of things today. But smaller household sizes and an elderly population are really changing the demand for different kinds of housing units all across the country. In places like Grand Rapids, where very few percent of the municipalities actually even allow for different kinds of housing units in their zoning, these issues are becoming much more important. But lots of different types of housing, from townhouses to accessory dwelling units to modern condos. There's a real demand for different kinds of housing units than there was before. They want a different choice and range in neighborhoods. Again, there's still a demand for the single-family homes, the traditional family homes, but urban living, mixed-use living, combining units with commercial and office uses, town centers, lifestyle centers. These things are popping up all across the country in a really dramatic way. It's changing the way that I think municipalities are thinking about accommodating the growth that's projected for them. Looking for a range of choices, of course, in shopping. We still have downtown, we still have the shopping malls, main streets, big box. People are looking for choices, looking for diversity, and they're looking for a range of choices in transportation. Now, some of that is intuitive. Again, the automobile still dominates, but there is still, there appears to be a real hidden demand for lots of different other kinds of transportation choices. Now, the important thing when you see these last couple of slides, I didn't talk about shifting from single-family homes to townhouses or getting people out of their cars and putting them on buses. The whole point here is about choice. And what we know about young people today, what we know about folks in the new economy, is that they are looking for choices. They're looking for different things, and they're looking for something other than probably what was the main way that we developed in the last couple of decades. They are looking for something very, very different. Everyone is going to get out of their cars, but the point is that places that are successfully transitioning to the 21st century are starting to think about these things, think about how infrastructure intersects with those things. The problem is that many places are just not equipped to respond to these really profound demographic changes. I know it kind of sounds like a broken record here, but we're still not dealing with some of these challenges. We're not responding to these changes. We don't have a mix of housing types in many places. We have separated land uses that separates residential from commercial, from office uses. That results in an automobile-dominated society, clogs up the roads, there's congestion in every metropolitan area. We'll talk about that. We have declining commercial corridors in many cities, and we have uneven metropolitan growth. It's not hyperbole to talk about the renaissance of cities, and downtowns are definitely coming back. But in most places, we have city resurgence, and we also have this massive decentralization that's still sweeping over the country. Some of those places that are doing well are thinking about their attitudes towards these three issues. First, towards density. Go back to this one. Sorry. Today's demographic and market changes are favoring more housing choices and quality development. Again, denser places are actually doing better than they've ever done before. In terms of design, more emphasis is being put on the value of place. Again, as I mentioned, the infrastructure is the connective tissue, as Don prefaced the comments with. It is the connective tissue that is connecting these areas and making these places function. And diversity, in terms of the tolerant, inclusive places, are highly sought after. They're able to respond to challenges much more quickly. Immigration is still a huge issue all across the country. Minorities are suburbanizing. Those places that are able to respond to these diversity changes or demographic changes are those that are doing much better. So the bottom line for this first session, this first part of the talk, is that the metropolitan areas with a range of options have an opportunity to attract and retain young professionals, childless couples, baby boomers, new immigrants, and the assets of the new economy. There's no reason why a place like Grand Rapids shouldn't be able to capitalize on these dramatic changes that are going on. There are a lot of places that are resisting these changes. They still are operating as if it's 1955 all over again. I would encourage you, and I think that we're doing that here in this region, to think differently about the future. It's very important. So that's the context. I probably spent too long on that, but I really think it's very important for having a conversation about infrastructure today. And it's all well and good, but the problem when you come to infrastructure is that there are major challenges that are existing all across the country, and that the context really isn't coming out. We're focusing a lot on these challenges, which are very, very important. So there are several challenges related to infrastructure in the largest metropolitan areas, including places like Grand Rapids. Again, traffic congestion is something that is plaguing even the smallest places. To some extent, every region at least believes that they have a traffic congestion problem. And it's certainly true in many places. We have substandard transit in most places. I'll talk about that. We have crumbling water and sewer with little attention on how to fix that problem. Climate change is a huge issue I'll talk about, and job access is another thing. So some of these challenges are related to infrastructure itself, like substandard transit or the water sewer. Some of these things are related to problems or byproducts from problems with infrastructure. This is the last scatter plot that I'll show you, so don't worry about that. There's no shortage of passionate tomes commissioned by business, by civic, by corporate leaders about the problem of congestion. And it is certainly something that is a major problem. It's hampering competitiveness. It's hampering freight movement. I think you all know the stories around that. But through all the noise about congestion, the one thing that is not coming out is that congestion really is a metropolitan problem. I talked about this with somebody just this morning. It's not something that localities can really deal with by themselves. It's something a little bit smaller than states. It really is a metropolitan issue. It is costing the American economy about $200 billion per year, mostly in metropolitan areas like Grand Rapids, where the total cost to this region is about $100 million in wasted time and fuel. There's actually not that much research about the problem of congestion, but those that are out there, it gets cited a lot. You may have heard these stats before. What this scatter plot shows is that it puts the metropolitan areas based on their size
and the annual hours of delay per traveler. And you can see that if you can hit the larger the metropolitan area, the bigger the congestion problem. So as metropolitan areas grow and flourish and become larger, the congestion problem gets bigger. So that line shows that there's pretty much a fairly direct correlation. LA and New York, literally off the charts, but you can see other large places there. Grand Rapids, right about in the middle, which you probably would expect, but right about on that line, the nexus between metropolitan area size and traffic congestion. The bigger places have the bigger problems. Now, the reason why we have traffic congestion, I think, is intuitive to a lot of people. The conversations around infrastructure usually focus on, well, we haven't built enough roadway infrastructure to deal with the congestion problem. And in some places that is certainly true, but you have to ask yourselves now whether or not that is a sustainable policy approach for dealing with the problem of the 21st century. We know that there's a lot of cars on the road. What this chart shows is the percent increase each year in its vehicle miles traveled, its gasoline, vehicles, licensed drivers, and population. So there's a lot more people, there's no doubt about it. I know it's kind of hard to see. But the licensed drivers are increasing at a slightly higher rate than the population growth. Vehicles are increasing much higher, and vehicle miles traveled, as you can see the top bar there, still continues to increase. The automobile-dominated nature of our metropolitan areas today are dictating that we're going to have a congestion problem because we have to drive more and more and more to deal with even rudimentary and daily challenges. Now, VMT in recent years is actually starting to plateau a little bit. We're going to get to that in a second. But it certainly is the driving thing behind a lot of the congestion problem today. Trucks are also an issue, and we'll get to that in a second. The next is that we have a very poor state of transit in this country. And most transit riders are dominated in just the big metro areas like New York, LA, and Chicago, and that's certainly true, Washington. But there's no reason that other metropolitan areas shouldn't have functioning, efficient transit. Work that we've done recently has found that in the 100 largest metropolitan areas, about half don't have any rail system at all, or they have what we call a bus volume per capita ratio, trying to figure out how many buses they have operating, less than the national average. So about half of them, which is a pretty high number. Millions and millions of people live in these places. Grand Rapids is one of those. Grand Rapids has a great bus system, an award-winning bus system, I believe, but it's a major metropolitan area that has, on average, less transit service than places like Davenport or Orlando, which is not a place you would think would have a very functioning transit system. Amtrak ridership is very low here, has fewer boardings than Whitefish, Montana, which is the place that they always hold up as the place we shouldn't have Amtrak service in. But actually, service here in Grand Rapids is lower than that. So again, there's no reason why a place like Grand Rapids shouldn't have a fine functioning transit system. You have a relatively healthy city, and transit is a really big part of that. There's a lot to do here and across the nation. Next is that water and sewer infrastructure is outdated and outmoded. There's lots of research coming out of the EPA around the poor state of the nation's drinking and wastewater. According to that agency, in this region, in this state, the needs are 8 and 4 billion, so 12 billion total for drinking and wastewater over the next 20 years. We have really, really big numbers like this in states all across the country, really daunting numbers that we don't have a whole lot of ability to pay for. We know that sewer separation work is ongoing here in this region, but the beaches still close a few times each year because of sewage overflows. You've probably seen the bar graph there on the left showing the number of closed beach days in this region. And while certainly some of that is due to new monitoring, we just know more about some of these problems, there's no denying that there is something terrible that is happening to the water in and around the beaches around here. The last quote I put up there because I thought it really was a good way to capture the problem, which we got from a Grand Rapids civil engineer. Don't know if he might be here today or she might be here today. But basically that we know what the needs are. We know that there are these water and sewer infrastructure needs. We can see it in the closed beaches. We can see it in some of the problems of breaking water mains and so forth. But there isn't really a desire to want to pay for that. So even though communities are getting the chance to do that, we see all across the country they're declining to invest in this water and sewer infrastructure for lots of different reasons. One is because it is rather expensive. The next thing is around climate change, and this was actually kind of tough to put into the presentation because we don't have a whole lot of work on this either, but it really is a profoundly important issue, and it's dominating the policy conversation in many places. I have a colleague who works for the Conference of Mayors, I think, and he said that no issue has gone from 0 to 60 as fast with that organization as the issue of climate change. So this is really starting to kind of just overwhelm all these conversations around infrastructure, around transportation, are being looked at through a climate change lens. Now, when we think about climate change, we've all usually thought about it as the map there on the left for the Chicago metropolitan area, which I know is hard to read, but it shows the places in red where CO2 emissions from vehicles are highest. And basically what you can see is that it's all around the city of Chicago and the inner ring suburbs. The blue shows where it's the lowest at the far out on the suburban fringe. And intuitively that makes sense. There's more people, more trucks, more buses in the city of Chicago, more CO2 is emitted. And that's kind of what's driven the conversation for a long time. If we just break down congestion and move people out, we'll deal with this problem. Emissions will go away. But the new way that we're starting to think about the climate change problem with respect to transportation is the chart there on the right, which is showing the same kind of emissions but relating it per capita. And when we flip that on its edge, you can see the transit, or you can see the rail lines that are kind of coming out there as tendrils. You can see the city of Chicago, much lower per capita CO2 emissions from transportation in the city and in the denser urban suburbs than in the far reaches of the metropolitan area. So as this issue of climate change becomes more and more important and it starts to drive a lot of the policy conversations, issues like this are really becoming important as well. The last thing is about the job access problem and spatial mismatch. And again, this is also a tougher one to show some graphics on. But we do know that as economies and opportunities continue to decentralize, even when cities are getting healthy, we still know that there's still this decentralization factor that's happening. We do have this spatial mismatch in many, many cities, like Grand Rapids, where we have minority concentrations and concentrations of the poor in these dense urban cores, and then jobs that are suburbanizing very quickly. The infrastructure that we have built today is not built to respond to these kinds of changes. We have a lot of these radial infrastructure from rail and highway infrastructure is designed to bring people in and out of the center city, mostly to get them out of the center city, but it's not connecting people with jobs in the suburbs. So in this region, we see that there is the darker lines there show where the minority concentrations are, and we know that about 1/4 of the jobs in this metro area, only about 1/4 of the jobs are within 3 miles of the urban core. 75% of the jobs are further and further out. Accessing those jobs and reconfiguring infrastructure to deal with this problem is also starting to get a lot of attention. So, that's all of these issues are really getting caught up in the conversation around infrastructure today. Again, some are directly related to infrastructure. Again, transit, wastewater. I mean, that is the infrastructure itself. Is building that stuff. A lot of the other things are derivatives of the infrastructure problem. But either way, the conversation around infrastructure usually begins and ends with a conversation about finance. States are still reeling from a lot of the recessionary problems they had just a couple of years ago. Localities are still kind of feeling the brunt of that. The federal government is broken, as I think I've said before, and probably will say again. But infrastructure finance is a real and growing concern. And what is happening today nationally, in Washington, but nationally, is this tremendous fear around transportation finance. How are we going to pay for all these things? Even if you believe everything that I said, and we need to rethink about the infrastructure that exists today, how are we going to build something different? How are we going to serve the center city? How are we going to serve these older inner ring suburbs? All that's a big question for today. There is, again, a pervasive desire on the national level to invest in infrastructure. A lot of prominent people are starting to stand up and say, we really need something different. We need a FDR New Deal kind of thing. We need an Eisenhower interstate vision again. We just need to focus on infrastructure and everything will be okay. And again, that's all fine, but again, there's still this lack of precision about, well, what exactly does that mean? And it's too bad. We have had some visionaries in the past. In 1956, the Eisenhower era for interstates, whether or not you think the interstates were good or bad, there's no doubt that Eisenhower and his folks had a vision. They knew what they wanted to do. They put the system together. They sold it to the American public because it was supposed to do something. It was going to connect metropolitan areas, get you stuck out of the mud. It had a vision. They sold it. They won. We got the thing today. 1991, we had the ICE-T legislation, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, spurred by folks like Pat Moynihan in New York and Norm Mineta, a congressman at the time from California. These guys had a very different vision for infrastructure just a couple of decades ago. It was going to connect the modes. It was going to work on land use. It was going to deal with climate change. It was going to deal with all these issues. A very radical rethinking for the transportation infrastructure we had at the time. It changed, put everything up on its head, whether or not you think it worked or not. Again, the fact is that they had a vision. They sold it, they got it, and that's what we have today. The problem today, we don't really have that vision. And it sounds kind of trite to say it, but it really is true. We don't have an Eisenhower or a Pat Moynihan today talking about infrastructure in new and expanded terms. It really is still kind of the same old approach. We have really no idea for what the national priorities should be. We have very little idea what state priorities should be. Some states have done a lot. Most states, frankly, have not. And we don't have an idea of what metropolitan priorities should be. I think that actually might be a little too strong. I think we have an idea in the metropolitan areas, but we don't have the mechanisms for implementing those metropolitan priorities. So the conversation in Washington, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, if I didn't put up a chart like this about the infrastructure problem. This is the chart that everybody is showing. It's a little bit different, but this is basically the problem today. The revenues that are coming into the Federal Highway Trust Fund, the Federal Transportation Trust Fund, are not enough to cover the obligations of the outlays that the federal government has committed to the states all across the country. So we had transportation legislation just a couple of years ago, and what is happening now is that basically the federal government promised too much money than they had to deliver. You can see here for a lot of reasons, which I'll talk about. That purple line, or the pink line, shows the revenues, and the outlays are starting to outpace those revenues. What's happening is that the balance in the Highway Transportation Trust, the Transportation Trust Fund, is being whittled away, and they figure that by about 2009, or September 2009, which is going to be a really interesting time in this country, given the campaign and the presidential election, that the National Transportation Trust Fund will be totally, well, not bankrupt, but it won't have any more balances to fill that hole, the gap between revenues and outlays. So this is the conversation that is driving most of the discussion around transportation today. Oh my God, we need to fill that gap, otherwise we're not going to have any more money for transportation. In a lot of ways that's right, but there's no focus on spending better. It's all about filling the gap with new and more revenues. So the reason for this is it's not hard to understand. We haven't raised the federal gas tax in a number of years, even to keep pace with inflation. So naturally, receipts are continuing to decline. What this chart shows in the blue is the adjusted tax rate when adjusted for inflation. Just focus here on the right side of the screen, showing that we raised the tax in the early 1990s, and it's obviously declined ever since. So the revenues that are coming into the federal government have declined pretty precipitously during that time. Interesting, we don't know why, but in the last year we had a big uptick in the receipts that came in. People are driving a lot more, I guess, in some areas. But the fact of the matter is still, we are still experiencing this downward trend in terms of revenues going into the Federal Highway Trust Fund. A lot of it because we just haven't raised the gas tax. And the federal government is not alone. And on the state level, real estate gas tax receipts are again leveling off. This has kind of fluctuated over the years, but the states also aren't making those hard decisions of raising the tax. So the green line there on the bottom shows the adjusted average tax rate per gallon has been declining since at least the late 1980s. And the adjusted total revenue has remained pretty steady. It's actually increased a little bit. It's not the same rate as the federal fund because some big states like California have increased the gas tax. But again, it's still the same kind of problem. We're not raising enough revenues, and so we're having these kinds of financial problems. So the gas tax is being whittled away as a source of revenue for transportation. And folks know this on the federal level and on the state level, and it's really, I think, resulting in a lot of hand-wringing all across the country. And what it's doing is it's saying, well, folks, we can't focus on the gas tax anymore. We need to focus on other things, like tolls, like bonds, like other borrowing, and we're doing that. We're doing that in spades. As you can see from this chart, tolls have increased 34% in terms of revenues from just a couple of years ago. Bond proceeds have increased by a larger amount. But the takeaway from this chart, obviously, is that the fuel taxes are still increasing. They're still providing the vast amount of revenues for transportation finance all across the country. This is not just on the federal level, but all across the country. The gas tax may be whittled away at some point because vehicles are getting more fuel efficient, because we're not raising the tax. But the fact of the matter is today, the fuel tax is still driving the conversation around transportation finance, And all the noise around tolls and bonding, which are very important and they can help manage demand, is not going to solve the problem. We really need to focus on the fuel tax. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Something else that's happening is that the states are having to reprioritize their own spending, and they're taking transportation funds and plugging them into other areas. And a lot of this is for good reason. Obviously, the big takeaway from this slide is the big increase in Medicaid spending over the last couple of years. What this chart shows you is the percent change in spending on the state level in these major categories. Transportation is down there at the end. Only about a 1% decrease, doesn't sound like very much, winds up being billions of dollars. And clearly what is happening here is states are having to reprioritize their spending, shift it away from things like education, transportation, and schools, and plug them into the big increases that are demanded from the Medicaid problem. The last thing in terms of finance is that we know that the costs of the materials themselves are just skyrocketing all across the country. And this is the kind of thing that people put up and they kind of glaze over, and I understand that, but it really is changing a lot of things about how we plan projects and how we raise revenue for specific projects. What this shows is that it's 2003 and 2004. It's the consumer price index and the producer price index for several different things, for all urban goods, for finished goods, for highway and street materials, and for other heavy construction. So looking at the last two, you can see from 2003 to 2004, major increases in the price of these materials. And there's lots of different reasons for that we could talk about. A lot of it is the competition from overseas, China and India, places that are just building tremendously, driving up the cost for these materials. Congestion is a huge increase in the prices because the goods just can't get out of the ports, can't get across the country. Those are driving up prices. And land use certainly has a big role in this. Land is becoming more and more expensive. When you try to plan out projects, the rights of way to acquire that land is tremendously important. Not reflected there, but all of those things are also driving the finance conversation today. So those finance problems are mainly focused on surface transportation, as you saw, mostly because that's where a lot of the attention has been today. People are really kind of hyperventilating all across the country, quite frankly, because these finance problems are looming in terms of transportation. The federal government has already had to claw money back from the states. They've clawed money back from Michigan and other places because they don't have the revenues to cover their obligations. But there are, so I've talked about water, sewer, and those kinds of issues, but now I'm going to hit on the policy problem. And again, it's not just the fact that costs are increasing or that we have some of these spatial mismatch problems, but there really is a fundamental policy problem that's happening on the federal, state, metropolitan, and the local levels, and I'll hit on those next. Federal government is out to lunch. So I'm from Washington, I guess I could say that. So, but it's really not hyperbole to say that there is no coherent federal policy for infrastructure today. We have some things. We have the Clean Air Act. We have the Clean Water Act. We had the energy bill last year, a couple of years ago. We have the big transportation bill. But really what we're seeing is something like this. We're not seeing what Don was talking about, is a prioritization of funding. We have scarce resources, but we are not prioritizing how the spending is being allocated. This crazy chart, or this map, shows the location of the earmarks that were in the surface transportation bill just a couple of years ago. Grand Rapids got one, got an earmark. Everybody got an earmark, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but this is supposed to be called, this is the high priorities program on the federal level. It's hard to argue that this represents high priorities across the country. We got an earmark, I was saying before, in my little town of Falls Church. We got a bus transfer station, which we needed. Very important project. Not a high national priority. And that's what we're seeing all across the country. When it comes to surface transportation, there really is no purpose for the federal program right now if this is the way that it's going to distribute its funds. On the state level, we know that the politics around infrastructure really are kind of fundamentally broken. We're just not seeing a whole lot of vision. We're not seeing a whole lot of new thinking about infrastructure on the state level. There's no emphasis on better as opposed to more spending. There's very little emphasis on reform. Again, I keep saying that, but we're kind of just plugging away the same way that we've been doing it for the last couple of decades. No emphasis on doing something different. There's no targeting of spending to critical areas. So again, we have a fiscally constrained climate, and we really believe that these investments should be prioritized, and they're not. They're completely politicized. They're not prioritized. There's no recognition of the primacy of metropolitan areas. We know that when you start to map investments on the state level, When you start to see where money is going, it's going disproportionately outside of metropolitan areas, even though these are places that are driving the economy, they're generating the revenues. Most of the money is going outside, or percent terms, is going outside of metropolitan areas in state after state. There's no attention to reducing the demand for spending. Again, the conversation is about plugging gaps. Well, we have these needs. We need to plug those needs. It's not the way businesses run. It's not the way that government should run either. There's few rewards for reducing land consumption. There are investments that are being made on metropolitan plans that probably are not sustainable over the long term, or they might actually be fundamentally undesirable. We know that the two things that people hate the most, density and sprawl, and those are the kind of things that we just seem to be funding in place after place. The last thing is that there is no leadership for making hard revenue-raising decisions. Again, another trite thing to say, but it really is true. The policymakers are just totally fixated on the safe alternatives to raising taxes or raising fees. And I'm not here to say we just need to tax everybody, but it's a very disproportionate conversation that's going on right now. There's a lot of focus on selling toll roads, on leasing existing assets, and all that's fine, and it needs to be part of the conversation, but it's not going to solve the problem. We need to think differently about raising revenues. On the metropolitan level, we know that infrastructure is just too fragmented, too compartmentalized. We deal with the major components of infrastructure in different silos. That is really not helpful for dealing with these issues over the long term. In transportation, the states run the show. The localities control the land use. There's usually an incongruence there. Regional local bodies govern transit. And there's generally inadequate capacity on the metropolitan level. I don't mean inadequate talent, but they just don't have the authority to make a lot of the decisions about transportation planning to really drive a lot of these changes. We can maybe talk about that. Housing programs are state-run, or they're devolved down to local public housing authorities. A place like metropolitan Detroit has hundreds of local public housing authorities, none of them really working together. We have no metropolitan focus, and there's very little attention given to the infrastructure that's needed to support the new growth and development or the old growth and development about regenerating existing places. And economic development subsidies are all over the map. It's kind of like the earmark thing we saw earlier. They mostly go out not in, we're giving subsidies, which is fine. We probably should be giving subsidies, but there should be some kind of targeting for those subsidies based on some kind of priorities, any kind of prioritization. Right now, there's very little of that happening all across the country. Now, on the local level, the public really is suspicious about new spending for infrastructure. Again, the reason that policymakers are loath to raise the tax for fuels or for anything is because people don't like it. It's not hard to understand. The reason they don't like it is because they're just not seeing the returns on those kinds of investments. Some of it is tough because some of it's hidden. The water and sewer kind of renovation thing is tough to see. Repaving a road. Some of these things are tough. They focus on new roads, things you can kind of cut ribbons in front of. All that makes sense. But what is happening is that the public trust in infrastructure policies and decision making really is uneven. There's more suspicion now than there ever was before, which is hampering the revenue raising problem. So we're increasing spending, but problems are also increasing as well. People are just not seeing the return on their investment. A lot of that is because spending, mostly on transportation, but in other areas is not transparent, it's not accessible, and it's not accountable. There's no priority, there's no performance measures, there's no way to measure how we're spending this money any better. We really, really need to do that. The public wants to know what they're going to get as a return for their investment, and policymakers really need to explain that very clearly. We are seeing this increase in local taxes, local option taxes that are coming before voters every year to pay for infrastructure. There is this kind of sea changes going on. I know that this region has supported increase in taxes to pay for transit, I think last May, just recently. And that's good. If you explain things to the public, if you put a compelling case in front of them, they're going to support it. If you're going to do the same old, they're not going to support it. We see that all across the country. So the last thing, I'm running out of time. I knew I would ramble too long. And I know this hasn't been a very positive conversation for so early in the morning, and I apologize for that. I had plenty of sleep. I don't know really what happened. But the next session lays out what I think would be a smart infrastructure agenda for the 21st century. There are a lot of things that are happening across the country and internationally, but I'm going to focus just domestically on some really positive things that are happening. There are some states, there are metropolitan areas that are starting to think different about infrastructure. They're starting to prioritize. They're starting to at least consider that reform might be something they may want to consider in the coming years. So given the disparate challenges and the profound, the demographic, economic changes, the economic transformation, the cultural changes, what would a smart infrastructure policy look like for 21st century metropolitan America? I do think that one thing is abundantly clear. When it comes to the provision of infrastructure, we do need to focus and prioritize, as I've said several times, which is really almost the opposite of what we've been doing so far. It's all a bunch of log rolling. Everybody gets something. We are not prioritizing infrastructure spending on any kind of level, including the local level. So addressing these challenges is only going to come by connecting a lot of the disparate problems. And I put this together here as kind of puzzle pieces because none of these, I think, are necessarily more important than the other, but they are all interconnected. The way we think about infrastructure really needs to hit a lot of different things, and none of these are more important than the other, but I think each of these are profoundly important in and of themselves. The first thing I really think is critical, we need to rebuild the public trust. The public just doesn't think that that infrastructure funding is being spent in a way that's very positive. Folks all know about the Bridge to Nowhere, which was part of the federal debate. My father knows about the Bridge to Nowhere. That means that everybody knows about the Bridge to Nowhere. But that's the kind of thing that is really starting to drive the conversation in a lot of places. What are we doing with this money? It's billions of dollars, and it needs to be spent differently. One good example is what happened in Virginia at the Department of Transportation that for a long time was actually one of the best DOTs across the country. It then fell into some serious problems. It was borrowing to the hilt and spending money on roads that were probably questionable. I think some of the worst rated road projects in the country were being planned in Virginia. It was just totally broken and dysfunctional. They decided to get a handle on that, to rein it all in, and to make a lot of the decision-making about specific projects in Virginia available, transparent, and accessible online to anybody who could go and access it from the computers. They have this dashboard project which helps you think about how projects are being conceived, how they're being planned, and what's going on in terms of construction. It's really made a big difference in the reputation of the Virginia Department of Transportation, and I really believe was not an insignificant factor in the reforms that state just went through in the last couple of months in terms of transportation. Folks generally believe that things are moving in a positive direction. This was not an insignificant factor in that. The next thing is to target spending. There's always going to be a need to provide some sort of subsidies and some sort of public infrastructure. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But as those funds get scarce, there is no reason that they should scatter in all directions. So a good example is what's going on in the state of Maryland, where they deny the state's entire slate of of infrastructure and economic development incentives to places that locate outside of what they call these priority funding areas. You can kind of see them in the red down there. But they decided that these were going to be the places in and around cities, older suburbs, the established areas. They said, we're not going to fund you. If you're going to go out there, that's fine. But the state has to prioritize, and we're not going to prioritize out there. It's generally been a pretty successful program. It's had fits and starts. But now it is part and parcel of how the state does its business. And I think it has better things targeted for the future. The third thing is to provide options. If we're really serious about dealing with congestion, if we're really serious about regenerating cities and older places, help moving jobs downtown, providing development opportunities, we really need to think differently about an infrastructure response that's more than just highways. And a really good example is what's happening in Denver. They sold this to the public. They voted on tax increases over the last couple of years. And they are planning what I think folks have rightly said is the most ambitious transit expansion this nation has ever seen, which is going on in metropolitan Denver. Over 100 miles of rail service, 18 miles of bus rapid transit, and huge increases in densities around the stations. They got the localities to buy in and to change their zoning and their land use to accommodate new growth in and around these transit stations. It's really going to make a huge impact on what happens in metropolitan Denver over the next couple of years. They're expecting a whole lot more people. This is how they expect to accommodate those people. The fourth thing is to decompartmentalize infrastructure. For lots of different reasons, housing, transit, economic development were kept separate for a long, long time. That should just not be the case any longer. And a lot of places are starting to break down these silos. This is much tougher for lots of institutional reasons, as you can imagine. But Illinois has a really good program, which is brand new, which makes it the first state to intentionally link economic development subsidies to places, to jobs that are close to affordable housing or close to transit lines. Again, kind of the same thing as the Maryland case, in that they wanted to prioritize where these subsidies were going. They know that they needed to help connect people to jobs. That's what this program is designed to help do. And the last thing is to link priorities to funding. It's different from the other pieces because I'm referring mainly here to new funding. And frankly, there's not that many good examples of this around the country. Washington State just raised their gas tax and targeted it to a couple of important projects. But probably the best thing that's happening is in California, where they have a state infrastructure revolving fund, which gives priorities to projects that serve existing serve underserved areas, places that have a housing plan, places that are trying to revitalize downtowns and stimulate job growth. So again, raising new revenues, but plugging them into places where the state thinks are important and not just scattering it in all directions. So I think I've just about run out of time. Just to sum up, I really believe that the infrastructure decisions that we make today are going to have tremendous impacts on the growth of this country in the future. The economic competitiveness of the nation really is at stake because as we think about, as we plan for these infrastructure investments, the focus should be on regenerating existing places, on making strong cities, healthy suburbs, and strong metropolitan areas. And we know, again, given that we are a metropolitan nation, that if our metropolitan areas are strong and healthy, the nation will be strong and healthy, and it will help it'll just help position us for competing globally here in the 21st century. I want to thank you very much for staying through that. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Again, thank you very much for your time. Well, we started off with an easy question. I don't think there is that much of a federal role in that respect, to be honest with you. I think that there are probably some things they can do, tinker around the edges, but the federal government has shown no proclivity for getting involved in those kinds of local decisions. We can argue or not whether that's consistent with what they do, but in terms of new reforms, I don't know if the federal government has a whole lot of role there, to be frank with you. I think that there is a profound role that the state can have. I mean, the localities exist because of the state. The state decides all of their enabling legislation. They decide what they can do, what they can't do. And Michigan had the land use task force the governor convened a couple of years ago that came out with very important, very specific proposals about what the state can do in order to affect some of these changes. Not necessarily exactly what you're talking about, but they were presenting some options for the state to consider to strengthen both local land use and the metropolitan perspective on that. I don't know to the extent that it intersects exactly with what you're talking about, but there's no reason why the state can't get involved and to enable the localities to have that kind of authority. We're seeing it in places. There's probably about a dozen states around the country where the state role in local planning is very strong. I'm not saying that they dictate what the land use should be, but they allow the localities to do a lot of different things that probably get to some of your concerns. But I can tell you, I mean, from working on the local level in Virginia and other places, there is no doubt that underlying zoning, those underlying land uses, is really profoundly important for setting the stage for what gets built and for the infrastructure that guides it. Maybe the Maryland plan is a good thing for Michigan to consider, where they won't provide those kinds of provide the economic development or the infrastructure subsidies to places that aren't consistent with local plans. I think California has an example like that as well. But I really think the state has a profound role in that regard. It's a tough question.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, you talked about changing demographics of the city and gave some elements that make up for a good city and whatever. And you talked about that families only make up 25% of the population and are going down. What role do you think, you did mention the element of schools. What role do you think that has in this equation?
Yeah, the two hardest questions, the legal questions in schools. I think schools have a profound role to play. There's no doubt about it. I think I had one line up there that said something about attracting families. And when we used to talk about regenerating cities, it was always, well, families won't live there because the schools are broken. Washington, D.C., Richmond, a lot of places that I'm familiar with. And I don't doubt that that is true. But I do think that there is some kind of de-emphasizing the importance of that issue for bringing families downtown. I think that their cities are shifting their strategies, and they're not focusing just on attracting families anymore. Part of it is because of these demographic changes. Part of it is because I think that they feel like there's just a different niche for them now. That as housing units get smaller, and they don't have backyards, and they don't have all these things that families with children may be looking for, they're just kind of retrenching and re-strategizing and going for the younger folks, going for smaller households, 1 or 2 person households, maybe with one child, but not going for the larger families that they were in the past. But the schools are tremendously important to that. Race is also very important to that, and race and schools intersect in lots of different ways that you don't have to talk about here. But schools is probably one of those issues under what you probably call fix the basics. You need to work on crime. You need to not be corrupt. You need to fix the schools. I mean, there are just some basic things that places have to do in order to compete in the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our